なたのすべてが好きよ好きよ好きよ好きよ好きよ一番好きよ
Urusei Yatsura Reborn, Episode 16, The Discreet Engagement. The abnormal gradually became the new normal in Ataru Moriboshi's life. The weekend began with Loom and Shinobu helping Ataru's mother in the kitchen. She had decided to teach the girls how to prepare some of her specialties. The idea seemed harmless enough, at least until lunchtime. Ataru and his father took their first bite. Their faces changed instantly. What the hell is this? The food was unbelievably spicy. Both men shot out of the room and raced for the kitchen in search of water. Shinobu soon did the same. Lum, however, remained calmly seated at the table. What's wrong with them? Shinobu drained another glass of water and struggled to catch her breath. Maybe aliens just like spicy food. Lum smiled. Could be. Ataru, still writhing in agony beside the doorway, could only wait his turn for another glass of water. But even his bedroom was no longer a safe haven. His scale models, books, and magazines had disappeared beneath an invasion of stuffed animals, fashion magazines, lace curtains, and all sorts of other things Lum and Shinobu had brought in. Ataru stared at the room. He barely recognized it anymore. This was my refuge. He sighed, grabbed his jacket from a chair, and gave up. Well, girls, I'm going out for a while. See you later. Lum and Shinobu exchanged a glance. They waited until Ataru had left the house. Ataru opened the front door. Just a few steps away, standing right in front of him, Cherry was waiting with his usual enigmatic smile. Ataru stared at him in irritation. What are you doing here, you horrible monk? Haven't we told you we don't want you around this house? Cherry tilted his head slightly. My, it seems you're not having a very good time. That's none of your business. A dark aura of misfortune hangs over you. Ataru frowned. And what exactly is that supposed to mean? Cherry calmly raised his staff. Don't leave the house. Ataru stared at him for several seconds. Then he exploded. I'll go wherever the hell I want. Furious, he snatched the staff from Cherry's hands and raised it, ready to smack him with it. But at that exact moment, he heard voices behind him. Ataru, where are you going? Lum and Shinobu came hurrying down the stairs. Ataru froze. He looked at Cherry, then at the two girls, then back at Cherry. Without a second thought, he handed the staff back to the monk. Here. And then he took off, running down the street. Ataru! The two girls immediately chased after him. Cherry remained standing in front of the house, watching the three of them disappear down the street. His smile never changed. What an impatient young man. As he walked, Ataru thought about his situation. I have to break off this engagement with Lum and Shinobu. If this keeps up, they're going to make my life a living hell. Then an idea struck him. I've got it. They forced me into this engagement on the spur of the moment, after that crazy night. If I can find some other girls and prove that I'm cheating on them, they'll have no choice but to call off the engagement. Ataru smiled. A few minutes later, he arrived at the park and went back to doing what he did best. Hi there, miss. What's your name? He pulled out his notebook. And your phone number? Most of the girls ignored him. The ones who didn't usually ended up slapping him whenever Ataru became too persistent. But he refused to give up, until Sakura appeared. The priestess was returning from a shopping trip when Ataru spotted her. From the other side of the park, he called out, Sakura, my beautiful nurse! Sakura didn't answer. She simply grabbed him in a judo hold and threw him to the ground. Ow! Ataru slowly lifted his head. Hovering above him was Lum. Standing beside her with her arms crossed was Shinobu. Both girls looked furious. Lum stared down at him with a dangerously sweet smile. So this was the important errand you had to take care of. Shinobu shook her head. What a scoundrel! He was cheating on us. Ataru barely had time to react. Wait, I can explain! A bolt of electricity shot through his body. Ataru writhed on the ground. Shinobu grabbed him by the collar. Let's go home. The two girls grabbed him and began dragging him back. As they disappeared down the street, Ataru once again came to terms with reality. He wasn't engaged to two girls. He was their prisoner. Once they got back home, the three of them hurried upstairs. The moment they entered the bedroom, Shinobu shoved Ataru toward the middle of the room. Ataru, How could you cheat on me with the first attractive girl you happen to see? Lum immediately grabbed him by one arm and pulled him toward her. And I can't believe that even though you're engaged to me, you still have the nerve to chase after other girls. Especially after what happened the other night. Shinobu grabbed his other arm and yanked him away from Lum. I'm warning you. There won't be another chance. How could you do this to me after everything we've been through? After everything we've been through together, and especially after you proposed to me in front of everyone. Lum pulled Ataru back toward her. And I'm warning you, if you ever do anything like that again, I'll give you such a shock that even your mother won't recognize you. Ataru barely managed to open his mouth. But Shinobu yanked him back. Maybe he wouldn't be chasing after other girls if you didn't electrocute him every 20 minutes. Lum glared at her. Excuse me, little busybody, but as it happens, this bargain bin Casanova was already a womanizer long before he met me. What are you saying, you alien? I'm saying the poor boy is probably only trying to escape because you keep hounding him with all those complaints. Little bitter fairy. Ataru tried to sit up. Could you two stop pulling me around for 1 second? Neither girl seemed to hear him. Lum stepped directly in front of Shinobu and looked down at her challengingly. Shinobu didn't back down. What did you just call me? You heard me. Flying cow. Lum's eyes widened. Who are you calling a flying cow? The two girls lunged at each other. First came the shoving, then the tugging, and finally they started pulling each other's hair. Ataru was trapped between them as bolts of electricity crackled across the room, sending lamps, radios, and other appliances jumping. Books flew from the shelves, a desk toppled onto its side, records scattered across the floor. Within seconds, Ataru's bedroom had been reduced to complete chaos. Downstairs, Mr. Moriboshi sat on the tatami with his newspaper held up in front of his face. He wasn't reading a single word. Across the room, Ataru's mother pretended to be completely absorbed in the game show on television. The shouting from upstairs grew louder. She turned up the volume. A chunk of plaster fell from the ceiling. Neither of them said a word. Another tremendous crash shook the house. Mr. Moriboshi simply lowered his newspaper a little farther. After a long while of shouting, crashing, and pieces of plaster raining from the ceiling, everything suddenly stopped. Silence. And once again, no one in the house dared say a word. Upstairs, Ataru slowly opened his eyes. He was underneath the futon, completely naked. Lum was lying beside him. Shinobu was on his other side. The three of them were breathing heavily, huddled together amid the wreckage of the room. Ataru looked at Lum, then at Shinobu, then back at Lum. How? Neither of them answered. Ataru let his head drop onto the futon. Once again, he had absolutely no idea how they had ended up in exactly the same situation. Hours later, Ataru Moriboshi was fast asleep. After so many sleepless nights, he had finally managed to get some rest. He was back in his bedroom, lying on the futon, completely alone. It was a quiet Sunday morning. No Lum, no Shinobu, no arguments. Ataru smiled in his sleep. Then he opened his eyes. He was no longer in his bedroom. He was inside a huge metal cage, surrounded by a whole pack of sleeping tigers. One of them had a paw resting on his shoulder. Another was sleeping pressed against his body, pinning him completely in place. Ataru stared through the bars. On the other side, several people were casually walking past. When they saw him, they began pointing and laughing. Shut up! Ataru whispered desperately. You'll wake them. The laughter continued. Ataru slowly turned his head. The tigers were still asleep. He had to get out without waking a single one of them. Then Cherry appeared. The monk approached the cage, leaning on his staff, a look of obvious satisfaction on his face. My, you degenerate. Looks like you'll finally have to pay for all your sins. Cherry, don't do anything. But Cherry had already slipped his staff between the bars. He dragged it from one end to the other, making the metal vibrate. The tigers began to stir. Ataru's eyes widened. One lifted its head. Another began to stretch. Without wasting a second, Ataru carefully took the enormous paw resting on his shoulder and slowly moved it aside. The tiger remained asleep. Ataru began inching his way between the animals, trying to reach the exit without making a sound. Then one of the tigers opened its eyes. Ataru froze. Another raised its head. Then another. Within seconds, the entire pack was awake. Ataru looked toward the door. It was close. very close. The tigers realized he was trying to escape. Ataru bolted. He raced toward the bars as the enormous beasts charged after him. He squeezed between them and stretched out one hand toward the exit. He was almost there. Almost. Then a gigantic tiger pounced on him. Ataru squeezed his eyes shut and woke with a start. He sat upright on the futon, breathing heavily. For several seconds, he had no idea where he was. Then he recognized his bedroom, still shrouded in the darkness of the early morning. Lum was sleeping soundly to his right. Shinobu was asleep on his left. Ataru remained sitting between them, drenched in cold sweat. It had only been a nightmare. Ataru looked at Lum. Then he understood what he had seen in the dream. Those tiger stripes weren't on the tigers, they were on Lum's bra. He had spent the entire night with his face buried against Lum's chest. Ataru went pale. He looked at Lum, then at Shinobu, then back at Lum. I'm trapped. Lum's eyes opened slightly. What's wrong, darling? Ataru jumped. Nothing. I just had a nightmare. Lum closed her eyes again and went right back to sleep. Ataru remained sitting there in silence. He knew there was no way he was going back to sleep. Finally, he got up and left the room. He needed to be alone. He went downstairs and into the bathroom. After turning on the light, he stared at himself in the mirror. Dark circles under his eyes, messy hair, his pajamas completely wrinkled. Man, I look awful. He stared at his reflection. If I keep this up, these girls are gonna kill me. He went down to the kitchen. It was still the middle of the night. The house was silent. Ataru prepared a cup of instant ramen and sat beside the window while he waited. Outside, Tomobiki was asleep. When the soup was ready, he began to eat. Ataru had always bragged about being a ladies' man. Or at least, that was how he saw himself. The girls at school and pretty much everyone else in the neighborhood of Tomobiki had a very different opinion. For Ataru, living with two girls and finding himself caught in a situation like this would have been, until very recently, the perfect dream. Something he could have proudly bragged about to all his friends. But reality was very different. There was nothing remotely paradise-like about it. It felt more like being trapped in the middle of a battlefield. Two bitter enemies fighting over the same territory, with him caught in the middle as the only prize. Constantly chased, claimed, and dragged from one side to the other by two women who had taken the concept of a strong personality to an entirely different level. On one side was Shinobu, strict, calculating, domineering, and demanding. A girl obsessed with order, details, and keeping every situation under control. And on the other was Lum, the alien invader, a breathtakingly beautiful girl who could make any guy in Japan, perhaps even the entire world, green with envy. But she also had such a passionate personality and such limitless energy that, instead of making Ataru's life easier, she kept him permanently at the edge of his endurance. And now, trapped between the two of them, Ataru was beginning to understand a terrible truth. What he had once imagined as every woman's man's dream had become his own personal prison. A prison without a moment's peace. And apparently, without any way out. Ataru gazed silently at the sleeping city. How peaceful. For a few minutes, he enjoyed the quiet. It wouldn't last long. The next morning, the Moroboshi household was bustling with activity once again. Lum was helping Shinobu get ready for school. She finished straightening the red scarf on Shinobu's uniform and gently brushed her hair. You look so pretty, Shinobu. Shinobu smiled, a little embarrassed. You really think so? Of course, you're one of the prettiest girls in school. Shinobu lowered her eyes. That's such a sweet thing to say, Lum. The beautiful one is you. Not many things could outshine the beauty of a princess. The two girls laughed. A few steps away, Ataru watched them while getting dressed. His expression said only one thing. What the hell was going on here? A little while later, the three of them left together for Tomobiki High. They were in a hurry. The school bell would be ringing soon. Lum glanced up at the sky and prepared to take off, but Ataru caught her by the hand. If we're going to be together, you're going to have to get used to walking with us. Lum smiled. Okay, darling. She lowered herself back to the ground and continued walking beside Ataru and Shinobu. For a few moments, they looked like nothing more than three students on their way to school. Then Ataru noticed something. Lum's skirt was a little shorter than usual. He stared at it for a few seconds. Shinobu noticed. What are you looking at? Nothing. Then why were you staring at Lum's skirt? Ataru sighed. I just noticed it's a little shorter. Lum looked down at her uniform. Oh, I'll have to fix it. I'm still growing, you know. Ataru and Shinobu looked at her at the same time. Growing? Lum nodded. Onis keep growing for quite a long time, and we're usually pretty tall too. Ataru swallowed. How tall can you get? Lum gently patted him on the head with a smile. Tall enough to protect you, little guy. Ataru froze. For a moment, he imagined Lum growing until she reached some monstrous size. An image of his father flashed through his mind. Ataru jumped. Shinobu looked at him in confusion. What are you thinking about? Nothing. Forget it. The two girls exchanged a glance and continued walking, but Ataru remained worried. Then he remembered something. There's one more thing. We have to be discreet. Lum tilted her head. Discreet? We can't tell everyone what's going on between us. If our classmates find out, there'll be an uproar. And if the teachers discover it, we'll be in trouble. Lum still didn't understand. What does discreet mean, darling? Shinobu stepped in. It means we shouldn't tell our classmates or our teachers what's going on between the three of us. A powerful gust of wind suddenly interrupted their conversation. The trees began shaking violently. People looked up at the sky. The wind grew stronger. Lum reacted instantly. She lunged toward Ataru and wrapped her arms around him, while Ataru instinctively put his arms around Shinobu. What is going on? Shinobu asked. Lum rose into the air in front of them and stared at the sky. Her expression had changed. She was alert. All three of them looked upward. A gigantic shadow swept across the buildings. A massive spaceship was descending over Tomobiki. Its hull was covered in tiger stripes. Lum's eyes widened. It's my parents. P above the street, and a hatch opened beneath it. Lum's father stepped out, accompanied by a detachment of Oni guards. They were young Oni, boys and girls not much older than Rei. Tall, solemn, athletic, and unmistakably military in appearance, they immediately formed ranks in front of the princess. Then, beside them, appeared an Oni woman nearly 2 meters tall. Elegant and youthful, she had 2 small horns and wore a long yellow dress decorated with tiger-striped patterns. Lum shot straight toward her. Mom! The woman opened her arms and caught her daughter with delight. The two of them floated above Ataru and Shinobu's heads, spinning around and hugging each other enthusiastically after their long-awaited reunion. Then Lum turned toward her father. Dad! The enormous Oni embraced her proudly. We heard the good news. Lum lowered her eyes shyly. Her father smiled. Congratulations, my daughter. I never imagined you had kept something this important so well hidden. He chuckled. I thought this whole thing would turn out very differently. A few meters away, Ataru watched the scene in silence. Then Lum's father turned toward him. His eyes lit up. My dear son-in-law. Before Ataru could even react, the enormous Oni swept him into his arms. Congratulations! Welcome to the family. Wait! Ataru struggled desperately to break free. Lum's mother stepped forward, and you must be Ataru. She hugged him as well. A powerful electric shock shot through the boy's entire body. Ataru went completely rigid between the arms of his future in-laws. Lum smiled. Mom, Dad, you're scaring him. Her mother released him. Oh, I'm sorry, dear. Ataru was still trembling, but managed a weak smile. It's all right. Then Lum's mother noticed Shinobu. She leaned toward her with a warm smile. Oh my, aren't you adorable? You're just as Lum described you. She gently embraced Shinobu. Welcome to our family, Shinobu. Completely bewildered, Shinobu hesitated for a moment before finally returning the hug. Lum watched the scene with satisfaction. Ataru, however, was beginning to worry. This was happening far too quickly, and the real madness had only just begun. Had attracted the attention of the entire neighborhood. Within minutes, journalists, police officers, military personnel, and government officials began pouring into the area. The streets surrounding the Moroboshi house were quickly surrounded. Cameras and microphones were pointed at the Oni family as reporters desperately tried to get a statement. Shinobu looked around at the chaos. Then, discreetly, she took Lum's hand. Is this what you people call being discreet? Shinobu gestured toward the enormous crowd. Lum looked around. She fell silent for a moment. Then she simply shrugged and gave an awkward smile. Ataru closed his eyes. What had started that morning as an ordinary school day had just turned into a worldwide event. Images of the Oni spaceship hovering over Tomobiki quickly appeared on television. First, the local stations picked up the story. Then, within a short time, the news spread across the country. And finally, it reached the entire world. Reporters spoke excitedly about the Oni's latest appearance on Earth. The cameras showed the enormous spaceship, the soldiers, and Lum's family, all surrounded by officials and members of the press. But this time, there were no ultimatums, no threats. The Oni had come for a much more unexpected reason, a family celebration. Standing before the cameras, Lum's father stepped forward. "We have come here to officially announce some wonderful news that fills our family with pride." His words were broadcast around the world. "Our daughter Lum, heir to the throne of our people, has become engaged to two young men from this planet." Every eye turned toward Lum, Shinobu, and Ataru. Lum smiled proudly. Shinobu looked increasingly nervous. Ataru, meanwhile, wanted to disappear. But Lum's father was not finished. "They are Aru Moroboshi and Shinobu Miyake." The announcement triggered a storm of questions. Cameras immediately focused on the three young people as millions of viewers watched the scene unfold. But Lum's father still had one more announcement to make. "As a gesture of friendship toward humanity and as our daughter's wedding dowry, the Oni will provide Earth with an amount of wheat equal to twice the entire world's annual production. Toward humanity. And as our daughter's wedding dowry, the Oni will provide Earth with an amount of wheat equal to twice the entire world's annual production." For several seconds, nobody reacted. Then the murmuring began. The reporters looked at one another. Government officials exchanged incredulous glances. The figure was simply staggering. Such an amount of food on that scale could transform the world's markets and ease food shortages in countless regions. The news spread instantly. Television networks interrupted their regular programming. Celebrations began breaking out in cities around the world, while markets reacted to the announcement. For millions of people, it meant only one thing: food, abundance, hope. The engagement of the Oni princess was no longer a mere curiosity. It had become a historic event. Television screens constantly showed Lum, Shinobu, and Ataru, while commentators analyzed the political and economic consequences of this extraordinary alliance between Earth and the Oni. And while the entire world celebrated, Ataru remained silent. Until that moment, he had thought society's rejection might be his only way out. Maybe his classmates would make fun of him. Maybe his teachers would object. He had even imagined that his own parents might reject the whole situation. But none of that was happening. The entire world was celebrating. Governments approved of it. The media considered it wonderful. And Lum's family had just offered humanity enough food to change the lives of millions of people. Ataru crossed his arms. His face darkened. "I'm definitely doomed." Lum looked at him. "What did you say, darling?" Ataru gave her a nervous smile. "Nothing." The cameras continued broadcasting. While the world celebrated Lum's engagement, Ataru was beginning to understand a terrible truth. To everyone else, this looked like the beginning of a beautiful love story. For him, the nightmare had only just begun. Mouse Oni delegation began making its way toward the Moroboshi house. The streets of Tomobiki were still packed with reporters, police officers, soldiers, and curious onlookers, while cameras continued broadcasting the arrival of the extraterrestrial visitors. Finally, all three families gathered under the same roof. At the Moroboshi house were Ataru's parents, Lum's parents, and Shinobu's parents. Shinobu's father still looked as though he could barely comprehend what was happening. He looked at Ataru, then at Shinobu, then at Lum, and finally at his wife, as if waiting for someone to explain the situation. She, meanwhile, was barely holding back her tears. "I still can't believe it." Her husband gently put an arm around her. Meanwhile, Lum's parents seemed perfectly at ease. To them, this was simply a family gathering. Ataru's mother had prepared a huge stew, and the table was overflowing with food. For the first time that morning, Ataru was no longer surrounded by cameras, reporters, or government officials. There were only the three families. The conversation gradually became more lively. The parents talked about their children, reminisced about their own younger days, and eventually began discussing the future. Ataru listened, growing more and more concerned. Claro. Mantengo el tono de narración de audiolibro con un inglés natural y fluido para público angloparlante y elimino todas las marcas de tiempo. "I think they should wait a little while before getting married," one of the parents suggested. course, another replied. They should finish their studies first. Everyone agreed. Lum's mother explained that, according to Oni customs, the formal wedding ceremony should be held on their home planet. Afterward, they could have another ceremony on Earth, following human traditions. Eventually, they reached an agreement. They would wait approximately 2 years. Ataru froze. 2 years. The conversation continued. No one saw any reason to separate the three young people either. They could continue living together at the Moroboshi house and attending Tomobiki High School just as they had been doing. Ataru slowly opened his eyes. Living together. His mother looked at him as though the answer were obvious. Of course. Why not? While the adults continued eating and laughing, Ataru remained silent for a few moments. Finally, he gathered his courage and timidly raised his voice. And what if, for some reason, the engagement were broken? Everyone continued eating. Ataru swallowed hard. I mean, hypothetically. It's not like I'm planning to break it or anything, but if something happened, I don't know. Lum's father suddenly burst into booming laughter and gave Ataru an enormous slap on the back. To him, it was nothing more than a friendly gesture. To Ataru, it felt like being hit by a truck. What a funny young man! My future son-in-law certainly has a great sense of humor. Ataru forced a smile. Lum's father calmly returned to his meal. Of course, if something like that were ever to happen, it wouldn't depend on me alone. I am also bound by the laws of our people. Ataru began to sweat. The laws? Breaking this engagement would be considered an insult to our entire people. He paused for a moment, and therefore a declaration of war. The room fell silent. Lum's father continued speaking with complete calm. Naturally, we would act quickly to prevent the greatest possible loss of life. Ataru stopped smiling. Earth would be ours in less than a week. Nobody said a word. Then Lum's father smiled again. But of course, we're talking about a completely hypothetical situation, aren't we, boy? Another enormous slap landed on his back. Lum's father laughed again, joined by the other adults. Ataru barely managed to keep his balance. Lum watched him with one eyebrow raised. Shinobu, meanwhile, stood with her arms crossed, staring directly at him. Both girls understood perfectly why he had asked that question. Ataru lowered his eyes. In the end, he had no choice but to accept his fate. Perhaps his destiny had already been decided. That morning had begun with a nightmare inside a cage full of tigers. Now he was sitting across from several adults who were calmly discussing the details of his future wedding. He looked at Lum, happily chatting with her mother. Then he looked at Shinobu, smiling beside her parents. Ataru closed his eyes. The tiger cage was beginning to look surprisingly comfortable. The afternoon passed in a whirlwind of conversations and plans for the future. But the news continued to dominate television broadcasts. The major networks were still showing images of the Oni family and the three young people who had suddenly become the center of worldwide attention. Eventually, Ataru found himself once again standing in front of the cameras, alongside Shinobu, Lum, and their parents. The photographers got ready. Flash after flash filled the room. Lum's father stepped forward with a huge smile. Her mother joined him, and Lum moved in beside them. Welcome to our family, son. Ataru barely had time to react. Eh? All three of them hugged him at once. A powerful electric shock surged through his body. Ataru went completely rigid, his face frozen in sheer horror. The photographers kept taking pictures. The reporters laughed, and so did Lum's parents. Convinced that Ataru's reaction was simply part of the joy of the moment, the images were broadcast immediately. In millions of homes around the world, viewers watched the scene as yet another heartwarming display of affection from the Oni family toward their future son-in-law. Far away, inside an enormous mansion, Shutaro Mendo was watching the very same broadcast. Sitting in front of a gigantic screen, he silently watched Ataru being hugged and electrocuted by Lum's family. From a corner of the room, a young woman observed her brother's reaction. It was Ryoko Mendo. A mischievous smile appeared on her face. Mendo pressed a button. The screen went dark. He finally crossed his arms. What a ridiculous spectacle. The room fell silent. Ryoko continued smiling. Mendo remained motionless. That news had completely changed his plans. And very soon, Shutaro Mendo would have to step into the picture himself.